Hey there, it's Izzy here. In this video, I am going to show you how to create something called the 2.5D effect using current tools in 2012. To demonstrate this, I want to show you the difference between the Ken Burns effect, which is one way to animate a photo, and the 2.5D effect. So I'm going to show you a series of images using both types of techniques. See if you can see the difference. Sometimes it's pretty subtle. We begin the process in Photoshop, and you can see I have this image here of my son Aiden facing a tree. Now, the reason I'm using this image is because I really like all the levels in the image. It makes it very easy for me to separate different layers. For example, I have this front foreground element, which is my son Aiden, and he's facing a tree, which is just slightly behind him. And so you could say that's like a second level of depth there in the image. Then you have these trees here in the background, like this tree and this tree over here. So that's like a third level. And then you have the bushes and the foliage here in the background along with the sky. So that is even a fourth level. So I have four very distinct layers inside this image, even though they aren't actually separate layers. It's all in one single two-dimensional photo. And you can see I only have one layer right now. You can see in my layers list, I just have the one layer. Well, we're going to change that. Let's go ahead and duplicate this background layer. I am going to just click it and drag it down to duplicate it like this. And I have a new layer now. I'm going to double click on it to give it a new name. I'll call it foreground. Okay, so this is going to be Aiden here, and it's going to be just Aiden. So our goal is to select Aiden and delete everything else. Very first thing I'm going to do is turn off the visibility on this background layer. I'm going to make sure I get my quick selection tool. Now, there's a lot of different ways to select inside Photoshop, and this is just the way that I prefer to get started. And you might find that you need to use multiple tools to be able to get the job done. I'm just going to use quick selection right now. The way this works is I hit Command+ on the keyboard to zoom in a little bit, and then I'm just going to change my brush size by hitting the left bracket or the right bracket. If I hit right bracket, you can see it gets bigger. Left bracket, it gets smaller. I'm going to click and drag to select. Now, what it does is it tries to figure out what the edges are, and you can see it did a pretty good job of just selecting his shorts and his shirt here, and the marquee, the marching ants there, that lets you know what is actually included in the selection. So right now his shirt isn't, so I'm just going to click and drag here on his shirt and his arm, make sure I select all that, and I'll select his arm here. I'll hit the space bar to pan up and click and drag while I hold down the space bar. That's how you pan around inside Photoshop. That's a nice little keyboard shortcut to be aware of. I'll click and select his hair and his head, and it's getting part of the tree. That's okay. I'm going to go through and fix that here in a little bit. I'm going to click on his ears and his hand and this tool here. Now, you can see that it's going pretty quick so far, but I'm not really fine-tuning the selection yet. Once I get to the fine-tune stage, what I like to do is I like to shrink the brush down, make it very small, Command+ to get in really close around the edges. I'm going to hit the space bar and click and drag to pan around. And now what I can do is I can reduce the selection. I can subtract from the selection by holding down the Option key. Now you'll see there's a plus sign there normally. This is without the Option key being held down. Now if I hold down the Option key, you see that it changes into a minus sign. So anything I click on and drag while I have the Option key held down with the quick selection tool is going to be subtracted from the selection. So for example, there's this area here. It's including part of the tree. I don't want that. So I'm just going to click and drag, and I'm going to just nudge in there along the selection. And you can see that it's doing a better job of just getting his hair if I get in closer. Now, see, that was too far. So what I'm going to do is, without the Option key held down, I'm going to click and drag to get his hair here. And then I might find I need to get in even closer. Command+ to get in even closer. Shrink the brush size down even smaller. Hold down the Option key, and then I'll subtract some of this. It doesn't need to be perfect. Once again, doing this process, the more time you spend on it, a lot of times the better results you'll get, but it doesn't need to be perfect. Definitely doesn't. Okay, so a little bit of a dance going back and forth, subtracting things, adding things, subtracting here. That's looking pretty good. Going around the corner. Now this part's going to be tricky. I'm not going to make you watch this whole thing, but I'm going to go through and actually remove from the selection all these empty spaces here. So I'll hold down the Option key and click. I'm I'm not going to make you watch the whole thing. So anyway, at any rate, I'll hit Command 0 on the keyboard. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut now. I'm going to fix the selection so that it's selected the way I want it to be, and then I'll come back. Now I've finished the selection, and you can see that I have even painstakingly gone through and made sure I selected the popsicle sticks. If I hold down the Z here on the keyboard and click and drag to the right, I'll zoom in and you can see that I'm letting the background show through in the holes there. So this took a little bit of time, but not a long time. When you use the quick selection tool, it really does go pretty quickly. I'm going to hit Command 0 on the keyboard to zoom back out. And what I want to do is delete everything else except for Aiden from this layer. I want to have just Aiden on this top layer. So how do you do that? Well, the first thing I want to do is duplicate this layer. So I'm just going to click and drag, go down to the new layer button, and I'll make sure my foreground layer is on top. So I'll just click and drag to move it on top. I'm going to turn off the visibility of the second layer that I just created. Now, if I were to hit delete on the keyboard right now, it would delete Aiden. Well, I don't want that. I want to delete everything except for Aiden. So I want to inverse the selection. Go up to the select menu, choose inverse. Now I'm going to hit delete on the keyboard. Of course, the checkered pattern indicates that's an area of transparency. So now this layer, as you can see right here from this thumbnail, is just Aiden alone. And that's what I want. So that's my first layer. It is done and ready to go. Now I'm going to turn the visibility off on this layer. I'm going to turn it on the next layer. We'll call this the big tree layer. I'll give it a name, big tree. Now, right now, everything except Aiden is selected. I want to go back to just having Aiden selected. So I'll choose select and I'm going to inverse again. And then I'm going to use a new tool in Photoshop. It's only been there for a version or two, and that is called the Content Aware Fill. This does not always work perfectly. Sometimes it works perfect. It's like a magic trick. Other times it gets you close. Other times it's really far off. But it's a way that I like to start because it can save me time from having to use the clone stamp tool and that sort of thing. So with this layer selected and Aiden selected here on my screen, I'm going to go up to Edit. I'm going to choose Fill. Make sure it says use content aware, and then I'm going to click OK, and Photoshop's going to do a little work. It has to think for a minute here because what it's going to do is it's going to try to make up pixels and figure out, okay, what should be there instead of Aiden and replace Aiden with something else. There it is. You can see it did a pretty good job on this part. Not so good on this part. It's letting the grass show through. Not ideal. I'm going to deselect this so you can see this a little bit better. It didn't do a horrible job on this section, but the holes showing through, not so great. Okay, so what can we do? Well, you can start with the content aware fill, and then if you need to, use some of the other tools. Like for example, this clone stamp tool. This is something I use a lot for this type of work. The way that it works is you just hold down Option and click a target area, and it's gonna copy that area. It's gonna clone that area. So for example, right here, I'm just gonna Option click, and now I've selected that as the target. Meanwhile, you can see that if I come down here, I can click and drag and fill in this hole, and it's going to actually be pretty convincing. See that? Look at that. So I can just fill in the hole. So now I'm going to clone this area, come down here, do the same thing. There you go. I'll just fill it in. So the clone stamp tool, very useful for this kind of work. Do the same thing here. Okay. And definitely not perfect, but not horrible. Not bad at all. Okay, and if there's areas like this transition here, you can see where Aiden's arm was there. For this kind of thing, I like to use a little tool called the Spot Healing Brush. I'm just going to click to select it right here. This area where there's a line, I'm going to click and drag. In fact, let's just do a small one here. You'll see that that part of the line disappears nicely. Spot Healing Brush. Up here, you can see the top of his head area, same thing. That doesn't look too bad. Okay, so foreground, background, foreground. Yeah, it's looking pretty good there. I'll turn off the visibility on Aiden. And now for my next magic trick, what I'm going to do is select this big tree and only this big tree because I'm going to do the exact same process. I'm going to select it. I'm going to duplicate the layer, delete everything except for this big tree, and that's going to give me my second layer. Okay, so let's grab our quick selection tool once again. I'll make the brush size a little bit bigger by clicking the right bracket on the keyboard, and I'll just start selecting the tree. And I want the tree and only the tree. Now, I'm not going to make you watch the whole thing, of course, because you've already seen how I go about my selection process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut, I'm going to create the selection, then I'll come back. I've finished my selection of the big tree now, and I want to do the exact same process I did with the Aiden layer. So what I want to do is delete everything else except for the big tree. So the first thing I want to do is duplicate the big tree layer. I'll just click and drag it down to the new layer. Make sure big tree is sitting on top. I'll turn off the visibility of my big tree copy. And with the big tree selected, I want to delete everything else except for the tree, so I need to inverse my selection again, and then hit delete on the keyboard, and magically everything disappears except for the tree. So here's what I have so far: Aiden on top, then the big tree. And now I'm going to turn the visibility of the big tree off. I'm going to go to my big tree copy layer, and I'm going to call this second trees, because this is a second level of trees that we're going to have here. And for this one, I want to have the ground and the trees, but not the bushes and not the sky, which means that I'm going to need to inverse my selection again. And I can try a content-aware fill, although I don't expect that this is going to be very effective. Let's see what happens if I choose content-aware fill on this. And that didn't turn out very effective at all, not great. So what I want to do is deselect this now and fill in what I need to fill in. And I can use the clone stamp tool, the spot healing brush, a combination of all of these things to be able to fill it in. If I deselect this, you can see that it actually didn't do a horrible job in this section. See, this right part of the tree was showing through, and it figured out, oh, if that part's showing through, then maybe there should be more tree behind it. So it started to add that there. I might want to bring that up. This area right here, I want to bring this up. I want to get rid of these lines. I'll use the spot healing brush to do that. Let's start with the clone stamp tool. And I am going to option click over here, and I'm just going to start filling in this area. Now, these edges are the most important parts. The edges, the transition areas. Oh, Command Z to undo that. That doesn't look right at all. In fact, let me use the spot healing brush for this section here. All right, and then we'll let it do its magic. That wasn't great either. Let me clone stamp. I'm going to make the brush a little bit smaller. Option click over here, and then I'm going to just do this. Okay, there we go. That's looking a lot better. The most important part to get right are the edges, the transitions. You want to fill in the area behind the edges. So for example, right here, I want to get rid of this section. I don't want a clear line here. So let's make this brush a little bit bigger. I'm going to option click and come over here and get rid of this line. See, I want to, this is actually looking a lot better already. I want to make sure the edges are filled in. This is a good example of edge area also here. So I want to fill that in. Any place where the edge of the previous layer, like right here. So this is what I mean. The area behind this part of the tree, I want to make sure that's filled in. The area behind this part of the tree, I want to make sure that's filled in. So fill in as much as I can to make it believable. It doesn't have to be perfect, like I said, but just do as good of a job as you can with the time that you have to do this type of project. As you can see, if you really go into a lot of detail, it can take a long time to do it. All right, well, let me go ahead and fill some of this in off screen, and I'll come back when it's done. It may not look like a big improvement, but once again, the important thing are the edges. So if you go through and you look and see the edges, like for example, right here, behind the tree, did I carry this pattern forward? And if I turn off the visibility, you can see that I did. So I made sure and did that around all the edges behind the big tree. And now I'm done with this layer. So what I want to do now is I want to delete everything from this layer that I don't want to have on this layer. So for example, I don't want this background bushes, the sky. I want to select everything else and then delete the part that I don't want. And that's going to be this separate layer. So the first thing I do here, once again, is I click and drag to duplicate my layer. And I'll call the second trees. I'll move that up so that it's sitting on top. I'll turn off the visibility here. I'm going to choose my quick selection tool. Once again, I'm going to choose the grass. I do want that. I do want the sidewalk. I do want the trees down here. I do not want this section. I do want the tree. So I'm going to go ahead and click to add this to the selection. And I'm, once again, not going to make you watch the whole thing. But what I want to do is I want to select everything except for the background bush. Oh, that was way too much. I don't want the background brush, and I don't want the sky. Okay, I do want this here. This is all part of the ground. Anything that's touching the ground, I want to keep it. So for example, this ground will be on the same layer as this tree because you can see that the tree is touching that. If I were to have them at separate layers, it would look kind of weird. Okay, so don't want that. I'm holding down the Option key to deselect, and same thing right here for this section. Come over here and deselect this section. Don't want that in there. That's all part of the background. Let me finish this selection, then I'll come back. And we're almost done with this layer. Of course, what I need to do now is delete everything else except for what I've selected, so I'll inverse my selection. While it's inversed, I'll hit delete on the keyboard to delete the sky and that background brush. And this looks really funky, but keep in mind, I have layers on top that are gonna make it look a lot better there. Now I'll go to my final layer, I'll turn on the visibility, and I'm going to call this sky. At this point, I want to keep the sky and delete everything else, right? So what I'll do is inverse the selection again, and I'll hit delete on the keyboard. I'm going to turn off my selection to deselect it. Now what I want to do is paint in all of the rest of this using the clone stamp tool. Something like this, content-aware fill is not going to do the trick. So I'll use the clone stamp tool and just go crazy with it. So I'll just do Option here. I'm going to make my brush bigger. Let's do Option, click, and then I'll just paint it in. Oh, Command-Z to undo. It's probably a little too big. Option, click, and I'll go through and paint it until it looks the way I want it to look. This might look strange to you, and of course it does because I filled it in using the clone stamp tool, but look what happens if you add all the layers on top. Doesn't look so strange now. Of course, it doesn't look quite as natural, but that's just something that happens when you separate all the layers like this. Okay, so now the next thing we need to do is save this as a Photoshop file with all the layers intact so we can bring it into Motion. So I'm going to choose File, Save As. I'll call it Aiden Tree with Layers. And make sure it's a Photoshop format. The alpha channels, layers, and embed profile, that's fine. I want to make sure those layers are saved along with it and that it's a Photoshop file for sure. I'll click Save and then click OK. And now we go to Motion, and you can see I have my project browser window open. I'm going to select it's a Motion project. The preset I'm going to use is Broadcast HD 720. That's a smaller frame, and if you're working with higher definition, 1920 for example, you could definitely use that, 720 or 1080. I am going to choose a frame rate of 29.97 because of where I am. I'll set the duration for 6 seconds, and then I'll click OK, and that'll give me a project that's 6 seconds long. The first thing I like to do is some housekeeping. So I'm going to fit the canvas to fit the screen at this resolution. That's pretty small. 39% is the zoom level. I will also save this project. So I'm going to choose File, Save As. I'll call this Aiden Layers Animation. And then I'll click Save. At this point, I need to find my Photoshop file. Now, it happens that my file browser, you can see I have my file browser tab selected here. I'm on my Scary Cylon drive, and I have this Aiden Tree Layers PSD file, and that's what I want. If I select it, you can see a preview of it here. It says it's a Adobe Photoshop file. Now, if I just select Import, let me show you what happens if you just select Import. It's not what you want, because what happens is you get a single layer. I want all of the layers separately. So the default just import, that's not going to do it. I just have one layer. So I'm going to hit Command-Z to undo because I don't want it that way. What I need to do is click and drag the PSD file from the file browser onto my canvas. I'll get it centered here using the guides, and I'll just hover. I did not let up on the mouse yet. This is important because this menu pops up. It says, do you want to import as merge layers? In other words, merge all the layers together into one layer? No, that's not what I want. I want to import all the layers as separate layers. So I'm going to choose this second option. I'm going to close down my HUD, my HUD here. It's in the way. All my layers are grouped here in my layers list, and there's also inside another group. Now, I don't really need that, so I'm just going to click and drag my layered group there, bring it up on top, and then get rid of this extra one. I'm also going to change this layer to a 3D layer. The reason I'm going to do that is because I need to be able to work with Z space. Z is the depth. And so I'll just click on this little icon here to switch it to a 3D layer. And with this selected, I'm going to bring up the inspector, choose Properties. I'm going to go to Scale, and I'm just going to scroll it up just a little bit. I'm using the mouse wheel here to scroll up so that fills the whole frame. And that's the whole group there. So that's all of the layers all at once together. Now you'll see if I deselect, turn off the visibility of Aiden here, it's just like in Photoshop. I have the same thing going on. If I really want to see the magic of this, the next thing I need to do is add a camera, because it's the animation of the camera that's going to really add the dimension. So I'm going to choose Object. I'll choose New Camera. Doesn't look any different. If I scroll through, you can see it's just still a stagnant thing there. I haven't added any animation yet at this point. But once I add a camera, I get this little camera menu. And so if I choose Perspective and then choose Fit, I can orbit around here, and you can see there's my layer, still very flat, very much flat. Okay, it's kind of a cool effect there. I'm going to turn it off to the side here so you can see what happens. All right, so now let's do something a little magic. Let's grab Aiden. I'm going to select the Aiden layer. I'll open up the properties. I'm going to twirl down the transform position option so that now I can see my Z space. And you can see right now it's set at a coordinate of 0 for Z. Well, if I click and then just drag there, you can see that I can move Aiden away. If you look in the canvas there, you can see I'm moving him away from the background images there. In fact, let me move him to be about 1300 pixels or so. Now, I did this in the inspector, but you don't have to do it that way. In fact, let me choose the big tree layer, and I'll just grab this little arrow. The blue arrow is the Z space arrow. When I hover over it, it turns yellow, and if I just click and drag on it, you can see I can move it in the canvas very easily too. If I want to, I could bring the tree in front of Aiden, but that doesn't really make sense, so I'll just bring it behind him, a little bit like that. And then I'll choose my second trees layer, do the same thing. I'll grab that blue arrow, bring it up front, forward here a little bit, and maybe like this. And let's orbit around so you can see what it looks like. You can see it's almost like little paper dolls stacked up. This is why it's 2.5D. I've got two-dimensional layers set in a 3D space, so they call it 2.5D. Okay, well, I'm going to go back to my active camera now. Doesn't really look like much has changed, but if I select the Aiden layer here and then mess around with the Z space, you can see if I click and I can bring it towards us or push this away from us. I can make it go behind the tree. Don't really want that. I'm going to hit Command Z to undo because I like the spacing before. So now I have it set in a 3D space. The next thing I want to do is animate the camera. Now you can move the camera using behaviors. I'm going to use keyframes for this video so that I can really make everything very precise. So I'll select my camera here in the layers list. I'm going to set a keyframe with the playhead on the very first frame. I'm going to set a keyframe here on the Z space, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. Okay, not too far, maybe something like this. And then I'll move the playhead to the very end of the clip, and I'm going to zoom in. So we're going to dolly in. Maybe like this. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. It's going to start here, and then it's going to zoom in or dolly in to this point. Okay, so that's looking pretty good so far. Let's add a slight rotation. So I'll twirl down the rotation, and on the Z, once again, I'm going to set a keyframe, and let's just twirl it a little bit to the left here on the first frame. We'll move to the very end, and I'm going to move it a little bit to the right. Not too much. Okay, let's see how that looks. So it's gonna rotate there and dolly in. That looks pretty good. Now let's try rotating on the Y. Now this one you have to be kind of careful with, because if you rotate too much on the Y axis, then what happens is you can see the effect. It makes it reveal a little bit too much. So I don't want it to rotate too much. So what I'm going to do is start with -2, like this, and then at the very end, I'll have it go to +2. So we'll change this to 2, and at the very beginning, I'm going to change this to -2. So it's just a slight little change, a slight rotation. So it gives it a little bit more of that three-dimensional feel to it. Okay, so that's looking pretty good so far. Now, obviously, I have black space showing through. I don't want that. One quick fix for this is to just simply increase the scale of those background layers. So I'll select my sky layer. I'll click on scale and scroll up until it fills up that background. Okay, no more black is showing through. Same thing for the secondary trees. I'll do the same thing there. Let's see how that looks. Just scroll through. Yep, that's looking really good so far. And one thing that can be really powerful for adding depth to the image is to mess with the depth of field of the camera. And of course, this is where you can control what's blurry and what's in focus. So I'll select my camera, go to the camera menu in the inspector, show the depth of field options. Now on my system right now, depth of field isn't showing up. There's no out of focus areas because I don't have it turned on in the render menu. So you might need to do this too. Click on the render menu, go to depth of field, select it to turn it on. I'm going to turn up the blur amount a lot so we can really see the effect. In fact, I'll bring it up to 40. I'll bring it up to 40 right there. I'm going to change the filter type to defocus. Oh, looks like I missed 40. I got it at 39. Let me just change this here real quick. And 40 in return. So right now, what's happening is he's slightly out of focus, and as I get closer, he gets further out of focus. Well, it'd be nice if right now at this point, Aiden were in focus. So let's go ahead and change the focus offset. I'm just going to slide it to where Aiden comes into focus, maybe like this. Now let's see what happens. So he starts out of focus a little bit here, and then he comes into focus, and it gets a little bit more in focus as he zooms in, and that tree is just slightly out of focus. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have him come into focus a little bit better, maybe right around here at this point. So I'll change that focus offset. Once again, make Aiden very much as crisp as possible. Now that might be a little bit too much blur. I'm going to slide this down, and let's see what happens. Okay, so he's a little bit out of focus. There's those dimensions. Oh, Oh yeah, see, that looks really good. Now at this point, if I wanted to, I could add effects. I could line up more images after this one. What I like to do is I like to render this out as a movie and then bring it into Final Cut Pro 10 and use it as a video clip there. But at this point, of course, this entire workflow is entirely up to you. Just wanted to show you how I do it. I think that's really effective. 2.5 dimensions there in a 2-dimensional photo. So yeah, I think that's more effective than maybe just using the Ken Burns effect. If you have the time and the energy to create this, might be something you want to try. Hopefully you found this information helpful. I'll see you in the next video.